All right, you ready? All right. I'm Scott,
And I'm Mark.
and Franklin Graham is the worst.
Yeah.
I mean, is that not is that not accurate?
I mean, I honestly think there are worse people than Franklin Graham.
Yes.
Um, but in terms of living up to his daddy's legacy, yeah, he's pretty terrible.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is Church's Lame, and we are in our third year. We're going to take a little bit of a pivot here. Um, whereas we used to generally talk about how the church is becoming irrelevant and kind of mapping the I don't know, the skid marks of the path of the journey to get there.
Yeah.
We are going to talk about how the church is literally breaking America for a while and for the
Mhm.
foreseeable future. Um, I don't think there's any way you can divorce the Christian right, um, the power it holds at the voting booth, and the results, what we see been happening in the last few months. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So this week, one of our favorite punching bags has come back to the forefront. As we all know, um, Russia invaded Ukraine. As much as people want to,
Spoiler alert.
right? Spoiler alert. As much as people want to paint it as Russia is the victim, they are the ones who invaded Ukraine. And now that we have a new administration in place, it seems like the Trump administration is trying everything they can to bring this war to an end in as favorable words is hard favorable a way to Vladimir Putin as possible. So Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are talking to each other. Vladimir Putin and Marco Rubio are talking to each other, even though Marco Rubio used to be one of the most ardent supporters of uh, of Ukraine's independence.
Yep.
And who does Zelensky get to speak to? Um, Not a negotiating team, not Donald Trump, not Vladimir Putin. He gets a phone call from Franklin Graham. Yay!
Yeah. Like straight up, honestly, this would have been better if it was like Larry from Veggie Tales. Like a talking cucumber would have been like a more appropriate choice in this situation.
Yeah, like there's so much to unpack here. Obviously, there's the whole thing of like, how did we even get here to
Mhm.
where a communist country like Russia that has been um, I don't want to say enemy. That I don't like that word when talking about like a global community. But they've been super resistant to join the global community, right? Especially since
Yeah.
Putin has ascended to power. He seems to be transfixed on returning Russia to its glory days, which is fine, I guess. But how that entitles you to invade other countries, democratically free people, is a little bit beyond me. And how we are now maneuvering ourselves to make the victim the enemy and to make the aggressor the victim is I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind. I'm not having a hard time wrapping my mind around the propaganda. I'm having a hard
Yeah.
time wrapping my mind around how God's people, who are supposed to be people of truth, who are supposed to be standard bearers, who believe in an idea of um, that what's right is always right and
Mhm.
what's right doesn't change. How the church has been hoodwinked into this inversion of reality.
Yeah, inversion of reality, I think it's a really good way of putting it. I mean, especially because, when you're dealing with, war between two countries where there's a clear aggressor, right?
Yeah.
Um, it shouldn't be some, evangelist wannabe. And maybe I'm being too harsh on Franklin Graham, but he has no business being involved in this situation
Yeah.
whatsoever. He doesn't have the bona fides in the slightest to be handling, negotiations.
Yeah.
Um, the article you sent, Franklin Graham has a tweet where he's just like, "Well, I told him that this is a time for prayer." It's like, well, that's nice.
Yeah.
Um, Everybody already knew that.
Yeah.
Zelensky already knew that. Um, why aren't you spending all your effort chastising the administration that essentially tried to blackmail Zelensky into giving America everything that it has
Yeah.
in order to get America's continued help?
Right.
Um, you know, why aren't you criticizing Donald Trump, who claims to be a Christian openly in public, at least, for not being a peacemaker?
Yeah.
Um, for then after talking to Zelensky and being basically told, take a flying leap, then he talks about how hard Putin has had it.
Right.
Like like that's more of Franklin Graham's audience than somebody halfway around the world.
Yeah. And let's be clear here. I think this situation is a really good illustration about telling the real players from the fake players, right? Like, for instance, in the church world, a real player wouldn't get on a phone call and just like, you should encourage your people to pray for peace. A real player would call the White House and the Kremlin and try to broker a peace. And that's how you know the Pope is a real player, right?
Yes.
Because the Pope actually has the direct lines to all the major players and can assert his will in the form of, hey, when I speak, Catholics listen. So if you want Catholic support on this matter, I have some words of wisdom, right?
Mhm.
Where Franklin Graham, okay, the A team is going to go to Russia and negotiate directly with Vladimir Putin, and you get to call the guy that we chastised in the White House a couple weeks ago. And this is the part that's weird, because if Franklin Graham would have just kept his mouth shut, he's actually kind of a player, right? He is the head of Samaritan's Purse. He has
Mhm.
been actively involved in humanitarian aid. And so there
Yeah.
is a real relationship there between him and Zelensky. But that relationship doesn't exist for him to make spiritual hay about it in the media, right? That
Mhm.
relationship is there so that the church and God's mercy can come down on Ukraine in the form of food and water and medicine and rebuilding supplies, and that is the kingdom coming in reality in Ukraine. And instead he uses it for like Twitter vibes, X vibes, whatever.
Yeah, like it if I'm like wearing my normal altogether too cynical hat,
Yeah,
right? It seems like,
which is why we like having you here.
well, but it feels a lot like, like he's doing this not for the lulls, but for the 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 retweets or whatever. I mean, when you do something like this, if you're really doing it for the kingdom, you don't need to tell everybody else in the world that you did this thing. You could just be like, hey, like I feel personally that, like, maybe Zelensky, he needs, like, maybe like some encouragement. I'm gonna talk to him and try to give him some encouragement.
Yeah,
Hey, that's great if that's what you want to do. But then when you post it on, on a public forum like social media, it comes across to me as being less than genuine.
ding 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 ding. Yeah,
Yeah, because, like, I mean, like, how many times have we talked about, like, the public performance of Christianity?
yeah,
When scripture gives us clear guidelines, like, hey, do this stuff in private, like when you give, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing.
exactly, that's what I was about to say. Yep.
Mhm.
Yeah. And yeah, I agree with that. And then there's also this kind of like, there was a part of this article that made me uncomfortable.
Mhm.
It kind of made me feel like there's all these people that are in a bad position, and they know they're in a bad position. And the only choice they have is to be in that performative stance that you're talking about, uh, because because nobody wins if you make an enemy out of the United States, right?
Right.
And so Franklin Graham is kind of here, tweeting and Xing, kind of like in this, hey guys, don't forget about me. I'm still a player, and that forces Zelenskyy. Then that forces him to get on Twitter and say, yeah, we appreciate Samaritan's Purse and we appreciate Franklin and all he does for, peace and democracy, and the guy's trying to take his, survive a war with his countrymen. And I doubt the thing he wants to be doing is getting chastised in the White House or having to put love letters on X, just to stroke everybody's egos. This is not what he wants to be worrying about. He wants to bring this war to an end in a way that preserves democracy.
Yeah. And I mean, that's, I think, all most people want, um, is just that, like, people wouldn't have to be fighting just
Yeah.
to live their everyday lives. Um, and like Samaritan's Purse, it's like, hey, that's, I mean, like what they're doing, if they're helping out, great.
Yeah.
If I mean, like, there's only so much that's going to do. Um, like what this really needs is international diplomacy,
Hmm.
and it's such a big thing.
Yeah.
And like I think there's, it's perfectly legitimate to say that like we should, if we're if people of faith are involved, like that we would need to be putting our values into that.
Right.
And so it's like I'm not trying to say that like Graham just has no place in doing these things, like period.
Right.
But with many of the other things that we've seen Franklin Graham do and say, it leaves a bitter taste in my mouth when like he does these kind of elevated moves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's like I wonder if it does more harm than good in terms of like the gospel.
Right. Yeah, because there there are things that you can do that have a result, right?
Hmm.
And like you said, there are certain results that we all want. We want the stop. We want the fighting to stop. We want the bloodshed to stop. Um, we want for people to live normal lives. Um, those are the things that we all want. So what is it that the gospel demands? You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And that's what nobody seems to have a sense of. Franklin Graham, for instance, there doesn't seem to be any sense of if I am going to insert myself, do it in secret. Unless you can come out and say, look, I brokered a peace. Here it is. Here's the peace plan, right?
Yeah,
But if you can't come out with anything substantial, just shut up. And then don't just do things. And I don't I know we use the word performative a lot, but
yeah,
how about we use the word um what's a good thing? How about we not worry about so much about the cosmetic, and how about we start worrying about um what the kingdom coming actually looks like? You know what I mean? And
yeah, yeah,
and the kingdom coming can sometimes look like, peace, love, dope, right? Flowers and a single man standing in front of a tank in Tiananmen Square, you know. And sometimes the kingdom coming means that you need to tell the powers that be that they are full of BS and full of crap, and that if they expect to have the support of spiritual people, they should start acting in spiritual ways. Maybe start speaking some
mhm,
truth to power instead of kowtowing to it.
yeah. And we've had that complaint, from for evangelicals in this country,
Yeah.
um, for pretty much the entirety of this podcast. At this point,
Yeah.
is that there isn't a lot of that, and like I really feel like if Franklin Graham could be effective at doing anything, he would be more effective at drumming up like grassroots support for like aggressive peace measures.
Yes.
Um, I mean, especially since I mean, for the most part, what I see is that evangelicals are like, yeah, Ukraine needs to be left alone, and helped. There might be some people that think Russia is the victim here, but I mean, I think they'd be wackos. But like our administration isn't doing all that much to make peace. And like Graham could be like say, hey, let's get on the line with your representatives. Like you need to like let them know that like we want peace.
Yeah.
And instead of telling Zelensky, hey, things are bad.
Yeah.
So, pray. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't even think he needs to like get political about it in the sense like you're like advocate for calling your congressman kind of thing. I think he needs to get on TV and say this is what the Bible demands of us. You know, the Bible
yeah,
demands that that we save lives, not destroy them. The Bible demands that 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 we advocate for freedom of all sorts: personal freedom, religious freedom, spiritual freedom, political freedom, the freedom of speech. The Bible demands that we set captives free. We do not hold people captive to anything. We set them free. That's what the church does. And we do not put people in chains, but we free them from chains. And I think that's Franklin Graham. If he's going to take a role, that's the role he should take, right? He should be reminding Christians what it is that we actually believe.
yeah. And unfortunately, for a lot of people in like higher, I don't want to say higher level ministries, but like very like known ministries, like very widespread ministries,
Yeah,
like that's a problem. Because if you know that the people you're preaching to don't really want to hear the like what the word has to say,
yeah,
like there is unfortunately like a heavy financial interest to then avoid saying the things that are difficult.
yeah, yeah. And that's a tough place to be when you claim that your job is proclaiming truth, right? That's
Mhm.
not a good look. So yeah, it's just super frustrating.
Yeah,
That
I mean that's like my whole problem with celebrity pastors in the first place. It's
yeah,
like if it can be difficult enough for a regular pastor in a regular church,
yeah,
never mind when you have like a pastor of a mega church. I mean, like Joel Osteen hasn't actually preached anything meaningfully from the Bible in
right.
decades,
Yeah,
and he's got plenty of money.
yeah,
Uh, and like we talked, it's been a while since our last episode, but like we were talking about a guy who was basically eschewed out of his church, um, because he was telling people, hey, don't be awful to like, people of color and the LGBT community. Like, be good to them.
yeah,
And that was a bridge too far.
yeah. What did I see? I saw a reporting earlier today. There across the country, there was a peaceful protest in support of veterans, right? Because a lot of these Doge cuts have to do with things like cutting Medicare, Medicaid, and cuts to Veterans Administration, right?
Yeah.
And so there was a protest all around the country in support of veterans, and no major news network carried the story for fear of repercussions from the Trump administration. And
Mhm.
now the same thing is happening to the church. A church that used to very, very, very happily criticize liberal politicians and liberal agendas now will not speak truth for fear of what the state will do to them. And
And that's just
part, part,
terrible.
part of it is understandable, right? Everybody has fear, but part of it's pathetic, right? Part of it is so pathetic that you are so um, brazenly critical um, when it's them, right? But when it's us, and when you're afraid of the repercussions, like you become the ultimate snowflake. You know, when we look in the mirror, we all want to see ourselves as David against Goliath, right?
Yeah.
And in reality, all these pastors that talk a big game, they end up be the one cowering, saying, you don't dare go up against Goliath. And that we actually see their true colors.
Yeah. And I can understand that just given like the religious currents in this country are freaking weird.
Yeah,
When it comes to different Christian groups. Um, and different denominations, like it's something that we definitely need to struggle with.
Yeah.
I mean, but there's certain truths, that shouldn't be things that we can argue about.
Yeah.
And it's sad when we do argue about them. Um, but hey, it's like if you're going to be a celebrity pastor, start there,
Yeah.
because like if all these Christians can't agree on what it is to be, a Christian people in this country, then like that that's just going to cause more problems than it solves.
Yep.
And then if we're doing all this infighting, then that's the real problem. Like, I mean, in terms of power over us, right? It's like people, like a lot of people complain about, there's the government can come and take over our lives. It's like, yeah, but a lot of stuff is happening that's already taking over your life,
Right.
and a lot of it's divisiveness
Hmm.
between Christians.
Yeah.
Like if we could unify and just kind of like exert, you know, I don't want to say like a force, but like, just like cry for peace so strongly, we basically would, coerce the powers that be into trying to make it happen.
Right. I think that's my point, though. Like the church has unified, and instead of representing Jesus, it represents all the things that Jesus hates. Is my point. Is
Yeah.
kind of where I'm at. Okay, let's land this plane. Okay, let's land this plane. Here's the final thing I want to say about this: is it's too soon, Franklin Graham. I'm talking to you directly now, Franklin Graham. It's too soon. As far as I'm concerned, you are still pants down on boat guy. Okay, that's the bottom line. You are not. You are not chief You're not master negotiator. You are not. Envoy. Diplomatic envoy to the Ukraine. You are pants down on boat guy. So could you please, please, please get out of the spotlight?
Yeah. The only thing I can add to that is that, your dad had the credibility that you don't.
Exactly. He worked very hard at it. He worked hard to keep it. And, yeah. Okay, final thing I want to mention here. It seems like this week in Christian news that the church has finally woken up to the realization that there is widespread killing in Syria. And
Yeah.
I've been saying for years and years and years that one of the measures our kids are going to judge us by is the absolutely lack of anything that we did to save lives in that part of the world.
Hmm.
So I'm glad. I'm happy the church has woken up to it. I just hope it's not an article for a week and then we go back to business as usual. Um, just like I hope the church takes the proper stand in Ukraine, I hope the church takes a stand um, everywhere where human rights are being violated, and that we find a way to redeem that. All right, this is Church is Lame. Um, we have opinions. We have a lot of them. We think the church is broken. We think the church is now breaking America. And so if you've got something different you want to say, you want to put us on our place, you want to give us the thumbs up, like and subscribe and thumbs up and comments and clickety, 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 all the things. And if you really want to let us have it in long form, churcheslamepodcast@gmail.com.
And with that, go in peace and serve the Lord. Amen.